This is the top cover of the transmission, looking straight down. The stick is in neutral when it's in that position. Slightly off center, rearward of the center of the paper gasket hole, and to the right of center of the paper gasket hole. However, it does seem to be perfectly centered with the 4 mounting bolts for the tower cover. So the problem with this particular transmission is a snap ring broke, which holds this gear to the rear of the main shaft coming out of the front box. I removed the rear box after removing the top shift cover. This groove here has another rod going into it in order for it to shift the different ranges from low to high. If you don't take off the top cover, you cannot remove this section. There's a tag on the back that says that. So right now I'm going to change the synchronizer. It is worn, and you can see a snap ring right there has broken as well. It's still working, but it needs to be changed, and I have to change the other one as well. The small tiny O-ring that I have in the case, the rear seal housing, belongs right at the gap between the bearing and the output shaft. Here is a key point that you should be aware of before you start taking it apart. These counter shaft gears have 2 zeros stamped into them. I put some yellow paint on them right here. Line those up with the teeth on the center gear. And since you can't center punch this gear because the metal is so strong, I took a die grinder and put 2 little notches, one here, just a mark on the gear as to where the 2 counter shafts mesh with it. So when one side, that tooth is in between the 2 zeros, the other side, that tooth is in between the 2 zeros. Key point before you take it apart. Okay, so once I hammered the output shaft forward, and it moved forward enough so that the washers on the back side of the counter shaft had enough room to clear that big gear right here, had enough room to clear. The counter shafts came out. Once the counter shafts come out, the synchronizer here, it has a number 4303257 in one spot, 4303256, and another number A5917. Once that's off, the whole assembly locks forward with the sliding clutch. Careful not for it to come apart, because there will be springs on each one of these pins. So now I'm left with this. What worries me right now is this movement on the main output shaft. I need to investigate that. So I have temporarily assembled this. So I have the nut, outer bearing, spacer, inner bearing. Then there's a stepped washer, this big gear, and that is the main output shaft. This goes on that main output shaft. So that center gear down there, those splines, line up with these splines when it's assembled. All the bearings that are underneath this right now, down here, and assembled with the slip yoke, which is on these splines, or sorry, not the slip yoke, but the drive yoke, pushes everything up so it butts up against this ridge right there, and then that allows this spline to mate up with the synchronizer sliding clutch. So I have the new synchronizer here. I have 3 springs for it. Put a little bit of grease on the tip of the spring so it doesn't want to take off on you as fast. Again, one quick downward motion and turning it counterclockwise. Assembled. So using 2 brake discs from a car, here and here, and a couple of old pulleys, I'm able to support the 2 counter shafts and the rear large gear, and I've made sure that this gear and this gear and that one are all timed together according to the timing marks on the small gears. When you assemble this, you have to make sure that the synchronizer is properly in position and assembled before you start. You slide the gear onto the shaft, the bearing, and don't forget about the bearing spacer between the inboard and outboard on the main shaft. Doing it this way, I simply have to lower the rear cover onto the shafts and fasten the bearings in place with plates that I have made. Just to avoid any mistakes, I'm going to put the bearing spacer in place right now. This shaft is labeled left, this one is right. I know that this is the top because that's your shifter. Lower the assembly into place, and you can see I've made up special plates to hold these shafts in place for reassembly. So I've installed the new seal in the rear housing, this speedometer sensor housing. New gasket here, the old gasket's already cleaned off. I have the tiny O-ring that I talked about way back in the beginning. That O-ring's in place. Now I need to reassemble this. But I found that the best way to do that, because the sensor's in place, is to slip the sensing ring in place first, then lower the assembly down. And what I'm doing is making sure that the speedometer sensor is covering that bolt like I mentioned earlier on. So here I am installing the shift fork and the shift fork shaft with new snap rings. So the problem is I need to get that in there and a snap ring on this side of the fork. So what I'm going to do is just put the snap ring at the edge of the shaft. So I'm not going to put it down into the groove. Put the fork into place, put the shaft in the hole, and walk it down in. And that makes the snap ring snap into the groove on the shaft and it won't come off now. So I'm making this bolt-on bracket so that I can fasten it to a floor jack. That way I don't have to get any special equipment to reinstall this. spare bits of metal, I'm able to make a mount that I'm just going to tack weld to a floor jack, and that can get me into the truck and get it mounted. It's a little bit better view. I'm able to spin it on the jack. And I should be able to get enough movement in the head of the jack in order to get it lined up. If not, I'm going to have to chain it into place so I can wiggle it into its proper position on the dowels. Something you need to be aware of before you take the auxiliary transmission out, this top cover needs to come off, because this shifting fork or shifting cylinder right there on the top cover, that piece fits into this groove. Now this is part of the auxiliary transmission, and you must put it in low range, which means moving this shaft as far as it can go to the rear of the truck. And if you're looking at it from when it's removed from the truck, the snap ring must be butted up against the rear auxiliary housing. If it's not there when you put it together, it's going to be virtually impossible to line up the gears when you're assembling it. As you can see, these steel plates that I made up, they have to be installed before you can install the transmission. Those counter shafts level. Otherwise, they will not mesh with the inboard gear that is on the back of the front case. Now, it will go together and not be meshed. I just did it. Put it together, it was out one tooth, and I could not spin the output yoke. Yeah, I could spin it, but it was really, really stiff, and I was not able to shift the high-low range selector. I wasn't able to move it back and forth. But now I'm in time, I can spin it, spun it quite a few turns, no problem, and it will shift back and forth. So this is the second time I'm putting it together. A couple of times while I was wiggling it around, I heard it come out of engagement with the shifter, but you can just reach over the top and into the transmission and pull that fork back while wiggling the output yoke, and it will slip back into the gear again in order to mesh with that gear on the back of the front case. These bolts here have to be tight for the most part, but you can't spin it when they're tight. So I backed them off less than a quarter of a turn, and now I'm able to spin this. And that way the counter shafts will spin, the synchronizer will spin, everything will work. And if it spins freely, you're good.